Please welcome Reverend Martin Junge.
Yeah, thank you very much for this warm welcoming. I'm afraid I don't speak Swedish. It may come still. It was a great beginning yesterday. I was so impressed by that celebration, by that worship, and to feel all that energy, all that vision, also all that enthusiasm about being the church in changed contexts. And I think my lecture, my presentation, is going to be a bit about that. And I will read, and I hope then we will be able to engage in conversation afterward. So let me go back to history. Because it is said that Dr. Martin Luther, back in the 16th century, was actually quite troubled when he realized the revolutionary impact of his 95 Theses. I actually just wanted to provoke a theological debate, he explained later, almost apologizing, surprised by the power of these 95 sentences, and maybe even wondering a bit in retrospect about his naivety for having nailed the thesis for disputation at the door of a church and therefore in a public space. Yet he had wanted to have a debate restricted to only a few. We know what followed. In a few days, his 95 Theses transcended the originally intended boundaries of a theological academic debate. Ordinary people took ownership of them, reading them, debating, distributing them, and even developing his ideas further. Luther's theological reflections had erupted into the public space. The 95 Theses of Martin Luther become what we call today public theology. A theology in the public space that speaks to the questions and dilemmas of the human family, offering insights out of what it knows and out of what it holds to be true because of faith. An exhaustive analysis of the reasons that led to this remarkable public reception would take too long here. Indeed, there would be so many reasons. However, there is one specific reason which I want to mention, because I believe it speaks quite directly to the topic of my presentation today. In my own interpretation, the ability of these 95 Theses to connect to the people and to connect to social debate at the time was related to the profound pastoral motivation. Yes, even more, the diaconal concern, the concern for the suffering neighbor, which inspired Luther to offer the thesis for disputation. In fact, the theological insights he wrote in those 95 Theses was something he had found out much earlier already. Therefore, for those who had listened to him before, there was nothing really new in what he was writing. Yet, the almost revolutionary newness of what he had to say and how these thoughts resonated with people in the streets and villages only surfaced and became so dramatically relevant when these theological insights associated themselves with a deep and passionate care for the neighbor. The 95 Theses, they were written out of concern, they were written out of care, and they were written out of pain. Luther had observed that people were relying on false securities for which, in addition, they were spending money that they actually didn't have. And because of what he saw, he felt compelled to write, to argue, to challenge, and to propose alternatives. The message of justification by faith alone was therefore, so to speak, a dormant insight until it got associated with that loving care for those suffering spiritually and materially, which enticed his message out into the public. I do recognize a feature here, which I have seen replicated in many churches of different denominations around the world. Their ability to position themselves in the public space goes hand in hand with their loving engagement with the world and with the people. The relevance of their message is tested in the church's ability to listen, to see, to touch, to accompany, and to discern, and then to offer its own insights out of the rich and deep treasures of faith. It is the love for the neighbor that ushers theological insights and treasures into the public, sometimes even by gently kissing these insights and treasures to awake from peaceful, sometimes even complacent sleep. This overall dynamic that moves the church's theology and praxis out into the public space captures a fundamental dimension of Christian faith in itself. This is because this movement towards the world follows the movement that God has initiated by choosing the incarnation in Jesus Christ as the way to reveal to humanity and to the entire creation who God is all about. God offered that first step, moving out of the realm of untouchability, out of the realm of apartheid, and entering with profound compassion into the joys and sufferings, the hopes and the pains of this world. In Jesus Christ, God celebrated the joy of a wedding in Cana, even making sure that there would be enough wine for all. And in Jesus Christ, God went through the torture and the humiliating death at the cross, thus making sure that every dimension of human life, even the most cruel and painful experience, would still carry the promise of God's presence. Despite this clear message that comes from God's revelation in Jesus Christ, I perceive that something seems to have happened to the common understanding about God, often putting God so distant, often picturing God as motionless, often assuming such numbness in God. God's radical movement towards creation, God's compassionate approach to human beings as shown in Jesus Christ, speaks quite a different language. If God so compassionately faced the world, can churches afford to turn their back on it? If God became so daringly involved in all dimensions of life, can churches afford to stay away or to lean back? No. Because of their faith, churches are caught in that divine tide that moves them into the world, into the public space, therefore, and the public space is then the only natural place for the church to be. I see the notion of the citizenship of the church, which I'm using in the title of my presentation, originating in this theological perspective. I owe the concept of citizenship to a Chilean Pentecostal theologian, Juan Sepúlveda, who describes the transition of evangelical Christians in my home country, Chile, from being politically, socially, and religiously marginalized people to becoming full citizens with all rights and duties in the social and political fabric of my country. From pilgrims to citizens is the revealing title of his book. It traces in a wonderful way the process of political transformation that needed to happen so that churches could claim their citizenship. But the book also describes the process of the theological transformation that the churches themselves had to undergo regarding their own self-understanding, so that they would actually want to step out from the margins, want to step out from isolation and claim their citizenship. The citizenship of the church, dear friends, is first and foremost a matter of its theological identity and of its self-understanding. As the church understands itself as being part of God's eternal and permanent movement towards creation and towards all human beings, thus it is sent into the public and acquires its citizenship. Here lies the root of its citizenship, regardless of the ways in which this is later expressed in legislation or the relationship of a given church to the state or the size or the age of a church, regardless of its gravitas, its weight in a given society. Let me at this point share something of my own biography with you. As a Lutheran Christian from an insignificantly small church, Lutherans in Chile are not more than 15,000 in a country totaling 60.5 million today. I was blessed to have been brought up in a church that understood its citizenship during the very difficult times of dictatorship. And this was not because of the size of my church. It was not because of its social or political weight. It was not even about their unanimity around the difficult questions of human rights violations, but it was out of its sense of being called into God's compassionate movement into the world. I was blessed enough to have grown up in a church that took the suffering and the pain in my country as an occasion for renewed scrutiny about God's call to the church in its own context.